Welcome back to Political Capital, the show where Delhi meets Dalal Street. The Finance Ministry has asked PSU banks to draw up a list of non-core assets to sell and raise capital. But Bloomberg TV India's analysis shows that most of PSU bank subsidiaries are bleeding cash and not adding to the bank's strength. Joining me now to talk about this, a veteran of the Finance Ministry, former Economic Affairs Secretary CM Vasudev, and ASHWIN PAREKH, a man who has advised the country's leading financial firms for many years now. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here at Bloomberg TV India. Let me start with Mr. CM Vasudev. And, while we are discussing about the non-core assets and the government asking banks really to draw up the list, what do you think? Would it in any way have a substantial cushion that it could provide to the banks in terms of once they pair with their non-core assets?
You know, this issue that you are discussing today raises a number of questions concerning the governance of these public sector banks. First, of course, is this political economy issue where the government shareholding in public sector banks, there is this threshold of 51%, so which leaves very little headroom for the public sector banks to raise capital from the market. And which I think many of these banks are quite capable of raising money from the capital to meet their capital adequacy requirements. So just because the government is not able to get the political muscle to remove this 51% threshold on government shareholding in public sector banks, we are thinking of these non-sort of market type of solutions. The second, I think, governance issue which this matter raises is that the Finance Ministry is giving this advice to the banks that you sell this non-core asset and don't sell this. These are not commercial decisions which the bank or the board of the bank is taking based on commercial considerations, but it is being asked to take a decision which is going to have a major commercial impact in the operations of the bank. So I think these are very basic governance issues relating to public sector banks. Now, coming to the substance of the issue, whether the public sector banks will be able to raise enough capital by selling these non-core assets, what is their valuation, that of course remains to be seen. But there are many areas, whether it is UTI or whether it is the stock exchanges or whether the credit rating agencies and whether it is the Industrial Finance Corporation and things of that type. There are a large number of good investments which banks have made, which if they do sell, probably they will be able to shore up their reserves and improve their net worth and make some impact on their capital adequacy. But I'm a little uncomfortable that we are trying to foist decisions on the banks which normally they should be taking on commercial considerations, just because government as the major shareholder is not able to provide capital for the banks because of some political considerations. So to my mind, that is a more worrisome aspect. I'm sure the banks will find some way selling this asset, that asset, to shore up their capital to some extent, and government will put in some capital. Maybe they will have to slow down their credit growth also if they are not able to raise capital. But I would think that the government should try to address this basic problem of removing this threshold of 51% so that the banks can truly work in a market oriented manner and raise their capital requirements through the market. Yeah.
Absolutely, Mr. Vasudev, you've really pointed out at the very core issue of this entire problem. But let me bring in Mr. Parekh here and to understand and taking it forward, while I'll come to the entire issue of the governance side of it. When the government is looking at the alternative like disposing of the non-core assets, that road, whether it is in tranches, will also not be an easy road to go forward, given the kind of requirements, the regulatory issues that the banks will have to comply with, and the overall environment that we are seeing. How do you see, do you foresee any stumbling blocks even in this alternative with the government, which the government is proposing really to the banks?
Well, I mean, I was looking at the entire thing, from a clear understanding of the kind of capital that is tied up, the public sector banking is tied up, and even the private sector banking to that matter, to that extent, is tied up in different activities. I mean, we are now calling them non-core activities, but let's analyze these activities. Investments made in asset management companies or investments made, for example, in exchanges or in rating agencies, the amounts are small. The kind of investments, the kind of market value, the fair value of these may have risen over a certain period, and the banking companies may realize, I mean, what was seen as an extension of their business, like for example, investment in rating agency is now suddenly viewed as non-core. So that's a bit of the only area where there is a certain amount of capital that's got tied up is in the life insurance companies. Even in general insurance companies, the total capital tied up by the banking system is not exceeding 2,500 crores. The total capital in life insurance companies is of the order of about 17 to 18,000 crores of the banking companies. In all, about 25,000 out of about 20,000 at the face value. If I take the fair value at 6 times the amount, then the public sector banks can realize some money, some let's say cash out of, or some capital out of return out of that investment, and that can be used for banking. The core issue is, I suppose, at the heart of it is how much can really be realized and what is really required by the public sector banking in the next 5 years in terms of capital. When I look at these two numbers, I really find that they're not matching at all. Priyal, they account for a very small percentage. I mean, overall, just about 10 to 11% of the total capital requirement of public sector banking in the next 5 years could be met by way of disposing of these assets. Now, that's just scratching the surface, I mean, I would say. So to that extent, if some of these are strategic decisions, as Mr. Vasudevan just rightly pointed out, and if there is a growth of value in it, perhaps the growth of value could be even more than the kind of value that you may recognize in the banking business, then it does not make commercial sense to merely dispose of only because the government is under pressure to meet with this 51% sort of threshold of equity in the banking system. So that's one area. The second area, Priyal, is, and this is something that thought occurs to me when we are discussing this important subject, is that the insurance companies, that is the banking companies who have invested in insurance companies, their investments are stuck up at this point in time because there are no clear IPO guidelines also. I mean, if there was a clarity on FDI, and if there was a clarity on IPOs, for example, then the banking companies could have gone and realized some amount of their investments at the market as well. But we seem to have created, from out of the policy issues, all sorts of fences and barricades around this investment which the banking companies have made. The banking companies themselves are at a loss at this point in time. They are not participating wholeheartedly because on one side the regulator is pressurizing them, the government is pressurizing them. They are at this point in time in a bit of a quandary, in terms of what is to be done with this investment basically.
All right. Mr. Vasudev, as we go forward, we have, of course, the Basel III requirements staring at us. We have the government's aggressive plan as far as the infrastructure investments and the others. Of course, the government needs certain level of investments, and there have been concerns as to where it would be coming in from. We have a stressed asset issue that the banks are dealing with and is a concern area. In light of all these circumstances and where the government is sticking to its point of wanting about 50 to 51% 51% shareholding, how would the bank's requirements, the capital requirements that it ought to have, be addressed going forward? What should the government be looking at doing? How would the banks be addressing this issue given the scenario that I just pointed out?
Yeah, this is a very important and basic issue that the economy is facing today. There is no question that we are a very highly underbanked economy. The share of the bank credit in the GDP is barely 40% or so, whereas in other faster growing Asian economies it is 120%, 30%. So we have a very major gap there. Of course there are reasons. We are a very large parallel sort of economy which is outside the banking system, and that's a very topical subject these days, black money and all that, which is I think a bigger problem, the black money within the economy and the parallel economy. But that apart, I think the banking sector credit offtake has to increase very significantly. It has to be much larger component of the GDP than what it is today. And I suppose action has to be taken on 2 or 3 fronts. One, of course, the public sector banks still have 70% or so share of the banking assets. It has come down quite significantly from 85-88% a few years ago. So private sector banks are expanding their base, but that process I think needs to be accelerated. And of course RBI has given banking licenses to new private banks, but more should be done. There should be greater encouragement for mergers in the private sector banks so that they can become bigger players, so that the share of the private sector in the overall banking assets improves. But the fact will still remain that for many years the public sector banks will retain a dominant share in the market. And therefore these public sector banks have to be sufficiently capitalized to meet the regulatory requirements of capital adequacy. And as long as this 51% threshold is there, that the government shareholding cannot go down below 51%, it is going to be very difficult for these banks to find the headroom to raise more capital from the market. So I think government has to very seriously consider to reduce that 51% to 30%, 40% or whatever. While they can, there are intermediate solutions which have been suggested in the past, that they can still remain creatures of the Bank Nationalization Act as most of the public sector banks are today, and at the same time reduce the government shareholding to 30-40%, so that government retains the power of issuing directives for social banking or directives for appointment of chairman, managing director, directors and all. So these are the main concerns which the political parties have in government ownership. All that can be retained, and at the same time the government shareholding can come down, so that there is enough headroom for the banks to raise money from the capital. Because ultimately I think the only sustainable way for the banks to meet capital adequacy requirement is going to the market. So they are listed companies now, they should be able to access, and I'm sure there will be many takers if the banks were to try to raise money. So action has to be taken on 2 fronts on your basic question. One is government has to improve the headroom available to the public sector banks to raise more capital from the market. Second is to accelerate the process of the private sector banks having a larger share of the pie in terms of the banking assets, and there are different ways of doing that. So action on both these fronts I think is needed, so that the banking sector can play a much larger role in the growth of the economy.
Well, on that note, absolutely run out of time, gentlemen, and that's all we have on this edition of Political Capital. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with more news on Bloomberg TV India.